last bit of hot chocolate that happened and take a seat, I would like to introduce Alex Hare, who is a member of our National Honor Society and a member of our Model United Nations, and he is going to introduce our speaker this evening. So over to Alex.
Good evening, everyone. I'm going to take a few minutes before the lecture to talk to you about Mr. Argentieri and recapitulate the topics that he will cover. Federigo Argentieri is an Italian scholar and academic who currently teaches at John Cabot University and Catholic University of America, Rome campus. He has been teaching political science at John Cabot University since 1996 and is the director of the Guarini Institute for Public Affairs, where he teaches courses on international security and comparative politics of Europe, Latin America, and developing countries. Moreover, he has widely published on the contemporary history and politics of Central Eastern Europe and Italy, particularly on the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 and its Western echoes and effects, as well as on the Ukraine. He also regularly contributes to Italy's most circulated newspaper and to other Italian and international media. In terms of his personal education, he studied politics, history, and languages at the University of Rome, Budapest ELTE, and Harvard. The main topic that he will cover today is essentially, do we need the United Nations? Subtopics include, 100 years have elapsed since the US President Woodrow Wilson has conceived the idea of a League of Nations. Why did the League of Nations fail in the 1930s? What did the United Nations inherit from it? Is the UN capable of fulfilling its main objective, i.e. the safeguard of world peace? Why or why not? Thank you very much for attending, and help me in welcoming Mr. Argentieri.
Right, thank you very much. Everything was accurate. I confirm. So, 10 past, so I'll stop at, say, 10 of, so that there's time to take questions and discuss. Okay, so almost exactly 100 years have elapsed since the 28th US President, Thomas Woodrow Wilson, spelled out the so-called 14 points. He did a State of the Nation speech in early 1918, so exactly 100 years ago. And the 14 points were a proposal, but a very strong proposal, a proposal confirmed, endorsed, and supported by the war effort that the United States had deployed in Europe ever since April of the previous year. Now, I figure you know more or less what happened during the First World War with regards to the US intervention, which came exactly at the right time to prevent the collapse of the Western Front, because Russia had collapsed in the east, so Germany had redeployed its troops to the Western Front, and the US came right on time to prevent landslide invasion of France. So at this point, Woodrow Wilson was not a neutral observer of European politics. He was a full participant, and he represented a country that had fully contributed, was fully contributing to the war effort that would have lasted another few months, almost actually the entire year, 1918. So the 14 points were related to various issues, and I will only single out the one that proposed a League of Nations, that is an international organization that would have had the task, the primary task, to prevent other wars. But the entire 14 points of Woodrow Wilson were imbued with his philosophy. His philosophy was, how can we prevent war from happening? Not with goodwill only, not with theories and schemes, but with a very practical statement. National sovereignty and popular sovereignty prevent wars. That is, democracy is the antidote to war. This was the gist of his philosophy. He has been proven right over the past 100 years. He has been proven right. We don't have, in the innumerable conflicts that the world has witnessed over the past century, we don't have one in which a democracy with a freely elected government has waged war against another democracy with a fully legal and elected, freely elected government. I have had this discussion with various colleagues and friends. Some have said, well, maybe you're right in general, but in fact, in the ex-Yugoslavia, the governments were elected and yet they were fighting with one another. No, objection overruled. Ex-Yugoslavia was not really democracies fighting with one another. Today, yes, there's democracies incomplete, imperfect in the ex-Yugoslavia, but not 25 years ago when they were fighting against one another. So I would say that Wilson has been proven absolutely right over the past 100 years, and 1 century is enough to establish a principle. So we must consider Woodrow Wilson as a politician who has contributed greatly to the understanding of why war happens and how peace is possible, by all means. By the way, Woodrow Wilson was a very interesting person. He was the first US president to visit Italy. He came here a year later, that is 99 years ago, again, exactly, in January 1919. He was welcomed triumphantly by Italians. Later, because of the peace treaty, relations would not have been that good, but when he came, there was a very excited welcoming. And one of the first things that he asked was, I want to go to the grave of Mazzini, Giuseppe Mazzini, because I've read Mazzini when I was a student, and Mazzini died when Wilson was 16. I've read him, I've read about him, and I completely endorse, I agree, I've learned a lot from him, I agree completely with his views. That was another sign of kinship between Wilson and a great European thinker and patriot like Mazzini. At any rate, the League of Nations was the main point, and the idea was accepted by the other powers, all the more so given that the US had a certain weight. I mean, their contribution to the war was enormous, decisive, and therefore, even if people were puzzled at the proposal, the US had enough strength to not to impose it, but at least to make it reach a high point on the agenda, if not the number 1 point. So the League of Nations came into being after the war and after the peace treaty, with headquarters in Geneva. And the interesting thing about it was that its charter, its statute was called the Covenant, which is a fully biblical word, the Covenant of the League of Nations. And this was another input by Woodrow Wilson. And it had a council which was composed of 5 countries which had prevailed in the conflict. That is, the US, in disparate order, the US, the UK, France, Italy, and Japan. However, the US were never able to sit on the chair because Congress denied endorsement to Wilson's proposal. Wilson had ideas about the US staying over in Europe, contributing to European peace, etc., etc. Congress turned down the proposal, and besides, Wilson became seriously ill and unable to run for a third mandate. In those times, you could still run for endless mandates as US president. And therefore, at this point, the League of Nations remained with an empty seat. And the other four powers were not very harmonious with one another, to say the least. Each and every one of the other four powers had its own agenda with things different from that of maintaining world peace. In a nutshell, the UK wanted to keep the empire together. This was the primary goal of the UK in those times. The empire must not only survive, but become stronger. France wanted to basically destroy Germany, because Germany had finally been defeated, finally from the French point of view, and had to be torn into pieces as much as possible. This was the French attitude, which was not helpful, because after the defeat in the war, Germany had gotten rid of the emperor, had gotten rid of the Reich, the Second Reich, and had become a democracy. Now, a certain nasty man called Adolf Hitler, who was not German but Austrian, which is not the same thing, would eventually have capitalized immensely on the humiliation endured by Germany when it had become a democracy. He hammered on the slogan, democracy equals humiliation. National humiliation, despise from other nations of Germany, came when we became a democracy. Wrong, but not entirely wrong. Wrong in general, but in that specific case, unfortunately, true. Okay? So this is not the ultimate reason why Hitler would have gained power a few years later. You cannot write history by saying if, but it's sometimes useful to say if. Now, if Germany had been treated differently in the moment it had become a democracy, and maybe even welcomed in the League of Nations, instead of waiting until 1926 before making it a member, perhaps things would have gone differently. Not to be ruled out entirely. Italy fell in a very paradoxical way. Be aware, if you're not aware yet, I'm talking to the kids, the grown-ups probably are already aware, Italy is a country of endless paradox. I mean, everything is a paradox in this country. And therefore, it's not surprising that Italy's democracy collapsed after a resounding military victory. Usually, democracies collapse after a defeat. But in the case of Italy in the 1920s, it collapsed after a victory. we have to, give up on hoping that things go differently. So the brutal fascist dictatorship of Mussolini came into being shortly after the war, and in the first dozen years of his rule, Mussolini held contempt towards the League, but participated. Italy had a good diplomacy, and so Mussolini thought that it was a stupid bureaucracy, useless, etc. But for the time being, it can be used for our purposes. And so Italy's participation was never very active, I repeat, in the first dozen years or so. Japan also had another agenda, which was to to expand its own power in Asia as soon as possible and as quickly as possible. And Japan was the first to destroy various principles contained in the covenant when it invaded China in 1931. And the invasion was absolutely brutal and was in blatant disregard, as I said, of many articles of the covenant. And Japan was one of the leading countries of the League. It was a member of the Council, which was the ancestor of the current Security Council. Nothing happened. Japan invades China. Good. Silence. No resolutions, nothing. No suspension of Japan from membership, no reprimand, nothing. Okay, 1931. 4 years later, encouraged by this president, Mussolini decided to attack Ethiopia. Now, Italy and Ethiopia had a messy past. Italy was a latecomer to colonialism. Italy took advantage of the Suez Canal in order to become a colonial power. The Suez Canal was built a few years after Italy's unification in the 1860s, and Italy was caught by the idea that you're not a real country if you don't go colonial as soon as possible. So we have to go colonial. Where do we go? We go to East Africa because nobody has gone to East Africa yet, because the Suez Canal has just been inaugurated, and prior to the Suez Canal, nobody circumnavigated the entire Africa in order to go to, Eritrea, Somalia, etc., etc. So Italy rushed to the Horn of Africa and also became, and then tried also to conquer Ethiopia, but Ethiopia was a strong African kingdom, very well organized, very well equipped, and all the other European powers had never tried to attack it because they knew that the resistance would have been very serious, and Italy underestimated this fact and received a terrible defeat, and Mussolini wanted to avenge the defeat and did avenge the defeat. Problem is that in the 1890s there was no League of Nations or nothing to prevent this from happening, and international law was a vague concept, very vague. It's still very vague, to be honest, but imagine in the 1800s it was extremely vague, if it existed at all. It existed only in some books. The point was that Ethiopia happened to be one of the very few African members of the League of Nations. So Italy was attacking from the point of view of the leader of the League of Nations, a fellow member of the League of Nations. Totally unacceptable, no less unacceptable than the previous attack of Japan. And in this case, Britain and France started to groan about it. The Emperor of Ethiopia spoke at the tribune of the League of Nations, protesting against Italy's invasion, etc., etc. There were sanctions passed against Italy, which infuriated Mussolini, who said, hey, wait a minute, you have colonized the entire world, you, Britain and France, and now you're groaning at us because we attacked Ethiopia. No. Problem is that the 1930s were no longer the time to create a colonial empire. The time for creating a colonial empire was 100 years before that. So the situation became very troubled, and the solution to the problem was a suicide committed by both Italy and Japan. They exited from the League of Nations out of their own will. They just slammed the door. They exited and slammed the door and said, you're criticizing us, go to hell. Now, both countries are begging on their knees today to be considered important countries in the UN context. There is a very nice Roman slang expression, in ginocchio sulle cocce delle noci. That's how Italy and Japan are in connection to the UN. We are good, we are great, we want peace, etc. Japan contributes an immense amount of money and counts like the Seychelles. One vote. That's it. Italy spends less money, a lot less than Japan, but still is there begging because of this precedent. These mistakes will affect the two countries for another several decades. And it's interesting that people at the Farnesina, I don't know about people in Japan, but I know that Japan has a very, very tormented relationship with its own recent history, very tormented, too tormented in my opinion. But people at the Farnesina get annoyed when you remind them of this, even younger people. They know, of course, about it, but yeah, why do we have to talk about this? I think we do have to talk about this because it's the problem, the beginning of the problem. The Nanjing massacre, or Nanking massacre, is another element that has been buried, swept under the carpet, and nobody talks about. It happened 80 years ago, another anniversary. In their occupation of China, the Japanese troops committed atrocities in the city of Nanking, which was the capital at that time of China. And then they have refused to acknowledge it. They're refusing to acknowledge it. And China remains tense. The relations between China and Japan are difficult because of this. Germany has apologized, has atoned. The Chancellor of Germany has knelt in front of the monument to the Warsaw Ghetto. I was your age, kids, when it happened, 16. I remember it vividly. The Chancellor, I remember my mother being overwhelmed, telling me, look at him. He is completely innocent of the horrible crimes committed by Germany, and yet he takes on his shoulders the weight, the load of the crimes, and kneels in front of the monument to the insurgents of the Warsaw Ghetto, which was one of the innumerable atrocities committed by occupying Germany. Nothing similar has happened with Japan. So the status of Japan worldwide is seriously affected by this. Of course, one could say, hey, how about Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Yeah, but the US are coping with it. The President of the US has gone to Hiroshima not long ago and has spoken with the Prime Minister of Japan about it. So these things are always important in diplomacy. So no surprise that the League of Nations fell apart, because the principles were constantly violated by at least some countries. There were no consequences or limited consequences. Then another case was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was accepted in the early 1930s. Then it invaded Finland in 1939 and was kicked out. So it was perfectly correct to kick the Soviet Union out of the League because of invading another country, but then the Soviet Union said, hey, wait a minute, why do you kick us out and not Japan or Italy? There are, double standards here. So the credibility of the League collapsed. And the UN inherited a very difficult situation. Now, before I go over the UN in the second part of my talk, I want to reach the conclusion. Before I speak, the conclusion will be anticipated. Do we need the UN? Yes. Are the UN effective in keeping world peace? Absolutely not, unfortunately, and for reasons which are quite clear. So, the UN are useful, have proven useful in many domains, but not world peace, unfortunately. We have to cope with it. Can they become eventually more effective in keeping world peace? Hopefully, yes. Hopefully, maybe even within our lifetime, most likely in your lifetime, kids, but you will need to make great efforts. I'm going to tell you a story, and a story that was witnessed by one of your alumni, an alumna actually, Margherita Blasetti, who came to John Cabot after she graduated from Marymount. There is a festival of diplomacy in Rome in October, organized by an interesting gentleman, and there are innumerable events all over the town, and one of those events is a mock trial in which there is a defendant, there is a court, defense attorney, prosecutor, and then the public is the jury. And I was asked to be the prosecutor at a trial against the UN. And it was very interesting. I mean, my counterpart, the defense attorney, was Frattini, former foreign minister of Italy, so not like a secondary person. It was a very interesting and thrilling trial, and then the public voted, and the UN won by 1 vote. The jury acquitted the UN by 1 vote, which I thought was good. I thought was good because great warning, but hope to change the situation. Now, after the Second World War, the UN was not very different from the League. A little better, because the experience of the conflict had been terrifying, more than the First World War. So people were scared and hopeful, but again, the differences were too big. The places of Italy and Japan defeated were taken by China, which in those times was united and bourgeois, in quotes, that is, had not gone communist yet, and the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union and China took the seats of Italy and Japan. But right from the beginning, if you look at the experience of the poor Trygve, who was the first Secretary General of the UN, right from the beginning, there was a problem with everything. I mean, Trygve said, this job is the most impossible on earth. Trygve was a Norwegian socialist. He had been appointed precisely because he presented a kind of point of median point between West and East. He was a moderate leftist who had fought against the Nazis, etc. So he was accepted by the US and the Soviet Union alike. But then everything he did was criticized by a part of the UN. So, for example, NATO was created in the late 1940s, a few years after the UN. NATO was created, which said, we abide by the UN Charter, but we don't want to leave everything to the UN because we think we need a strong regional organization. So in full harmony with the UN Charter, NATO was created at the end of the 1940s, and Trygve said, wrong, this is detrimental to the UN. And the US said, you are a Soviet agent. Okay, number one. Number two, North Korea attacked South Korea in 1950, invaded South Korea. And Trygve said, it is perfectly legitimate for the UN to react to this act of aggression, and the UN could react because the Soviet Union had pulled out momentarily from the Security Council. And Trygve endorsed and supported the reaction of the UN to the invasion of South Korea. And the Soviets, you are an American agent. Okay, 2. And then there was a third and a fourth case, which I don't exactly remember now, but it doesn't matter. Every time Trygve thought he would serve the interests of the United Nations and took a position, he was accused by one of the two sides to be an agent of the other side. So in the end, he went a little nuts. Even though his mandate had been renewed after 5 years, he stepped down after a year in the second mandate and left room to a successor. This successor was another Scandinavian socialist. The other problems of Trygve were the Chinese membership, which is an interesting case study. But we don't have the time to discuss it here. He left room for Dag Hammarskjöld, an easy name and a difficult surname, another Scandinavian socialist who also was challenged quite powerfully by events, and who also did not finish his second mandate because his plane crashed in Congo, actually not in Congo, but the current Zambia, which was northern Rhodesia in those times. I can't think that there was a country called Rhodesia. Sorry about that, but sometimes I have a... but most British subjects would agree with me. Unfortunately, he was unable to end his second mandate. And then after these two first pioneers of the UN Secretariat General, there's been a rotation among various... but the Secretary General of the UN doesn't count much. The real powerhouse in the UN is the Security Council. And contrary to what happened with the League of Nations, the Security Council does meet. People talk to one another at least, and sometimes talking to one another has helped considerably. If not the cause of peace, at least the cause of greater damage to peace. So I'm not saying that the Security Council is useless, but I'm saying that it badly needs to be changed. In the first place, there is the veto power. Interesting thing, the UN Charter mentions nowhere the word veto. The two things most commonly associated with the United Nations, which are veto and peacekeeping, are not mentioned in the UN Charter anywhere. It's an interesting paradox. But everybody understands what veto means. And the veto power, which is something definitely required by Stalin in the process of discussing the UN. Stalin was obsessed by, and probably he was right, obsessed by the idea of being voted down constantly. So he wanted the veto power to be absolutely enhanced and recorded in a different way, but it is recorded in the UN Charter. So every time that there was a world crisis, the UN, almost every time, the UN had difficulties in acting precisely because of the different interpretations. For example, communist takeover in Eastern Europe. Communist takeover in Eastern Europe happened between 1945 and 1948. And the United States and Britain thought that this was an abuse of power, and the UN should have done something about it. And the Soviet Union constantly vetoed. And then there were other cases, of course. France with Vietnam, France with Algeria. France with Algeria and independence struggle of Algeria is another interesting case. The Algerians were very smart because the Algerians were Arab nationalists. So they escaped the trap of the Cold War. Had they been communists, it would have been very difficult for them to achieve the independence of Algeria, but they were Arab nationalists, and they even gained the support of the United States. In a famous speech, one of the most famous speeches of JFK as senator of the United States around 1957 or so, was supportive of the Algerian War of Independence, which of course upset the French a lot. But JFK was right, and in the end Algeria obtained its independence by escaping the trap of the Cold War. So, now the Cold War ended in 1990, so long before most you kids were born. And the so-called Gulf War in 1990, which happened right at the end of the Cold War, is the only case of a unanimous decision of all the five powers, permanent members of the Security Council, to act in order to end a conflict by force. It's the only case in 72.5 years of existence of the UN. Why did it happen? Well, it was the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, and it happened because the Soviet Union was in its last months of existence and was very much reform-oriented with Gorbachev in office. So President Bush Sr. consulted with Gorbachev very smartly. He was one of the presidents with the greatest experience in foreign policy. And he went to consult Gorbachev and said, Gorbachev, would you approve in the UN of an action against Iraq because of Kuwait? And Gorbachev said yes. So the only time in history when there was a unanimous vote to end the conflict, which was ended shortly afterwards. The aftermath is another story, but the conflict, the war against Kuwait was ended with an armed action fully endorsed by the United Nations, and many Arab countries supported the effort, which created hopes for a more peaceful future. Unfortunately, no. The subsequent years were terrible. There were terrible fiascos. Now, I don't know why a weirdly shaped bottle with straw around it has become the synonym of a failure. This escapes my understanding. Why do you call a failure a fiasco? One of the mysteries of language. Anyway, there were terrible fiascos in subsequent years, notably in Somalia, unfortunately, in Yugoslavia, and in Rwanda. Three failures which almost killed the credibility of the UN as an instrument for defending and implementing world peace. The details I can develop another time or by answering your questions, but let's go to the beginning, my last minute. Let's go to the beginning. The UN, too, have proven Woodrow Wilson right. If countries don't share a certain amount of common principles, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to maintain peace. You must agree on what is democracy, what is transparency, what is accountability, and so on and so forth, at least a minimum level in order to be able to maintain world peace. On the other hand, the UN has done good things in the domain of human rights. Women's rights, believe it or not, the UN has done very good things in terms of women's rights, infancy, childhood, UNICEF, education, health, and so on and so forth. So the balance is, the glass is half full or half empty, as you prefer. There was a nice cartoon circulating on Facebook, half empty, half full, empty, etc. Various paradoxes about the glass being half full or half empty. I am tempted to say that it's half empty. I'm on the pessimistic side, but I encourage you under the age of 20 to be more optimistic. And the floor is open for questions. You're most welcome. I know you're shy. I sense that some of you kids want to ask it. Am I going to talk nonsense? Remember, there is no such thing as a stupid question, except the question that thinks it's smart. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so with the UN, for example, if we take developing countries and things like that, so how would you think we could encourage governments to be more transparent and collaborate with the UN? So how do you think that would work?
Oh, not an easy. Not an easy. Let's make a point here. Governments are interested in the UN. The UN is a world tribune. So even the tiniest islands, the smallest islands, some of the Pacific islands that risk to be submerged by the ocean if climate changes, are eager to keep somebody in New York and participate in the UN. So the point is not to encourage people in participating in the UN. The point is to work in order for shared principle to increase. This is a real struggle, which is a long-term struggle, inevitably. There are so many domains, for example, women. Is it appropriate for girls to go to school? Oops, I said girl. Somebody scolded me. A girl ends to be one at age 1. This is hyper-feminist, which really, I don't agree with. I checked with my daughters who are much older than one and said, do you mind if I go every now and then? No, but seriously, shared principle regarding, for example, the possibility of young women to be educated. That's a great struggle. It might take your entire lifetime, not mine, yours. It's difficult. But if it's not achieved, environment, it's alarming. Wildlife. These are alarming things. Is it a shared principle that the environment must be defended? It was until a year and a half ago. It's my answer to the question. No longer so. You have to advance. And don't separate human rights from human versus environment versus nature. Wrong to separate them. They must go together, hand in hand. So it's a daily job, a daily effort that you guys, why you especially? Because the Northwestern Hemisphere, which includes, you know what I'm talking about, Northwestern Hemisphere, must take advantage of its advantage to be more aware and more, bless you, and more prepared and willing to struggle and convince everybody that the struggle is everybody's struggle. Everybody who has the intention of conserving the planet, hopefully for many, many more decades, if not centuries, you see. So this is the effort. And it's difficult, it's painful. it has to do with solidarity, international solidarity. Always react when human rights are violated, no matter where. Never be ideological. In this country, it's good to violate human rights, and the other country, no. No, anywhere. Defending the women. I don't want to be a demagogue, man who defends women. No, I believe it. It's my sincere belief that women are wiser when it comes to development. No, seriously. When it comes to development, when it comes to education, when it comes to various factors which are essential for human life. So, they're not detrimental to the environment. Who is detrimental to the environment? It's mostly the men. Let's face it. I mean, I have reached a respectable age, and I can boast of having learned a few things from life. One of these is that men, M-E-N, are more detrimental to mankind and to, unfortunately, and to the environment than women, period. Prove me wrong, if you can. It's very simple. So men must also gain awareness in all continents. Leave room to the women to conquer the positions that they deserve. Let them rule. Sit in the opposition. So, I have my own views, of course, but it's a long-term effort in which you must be able to see all the various corridors that lead to a common ground, you see? Yes?
And what do you think that the implications of recent U.S. involvement in Israel are to the UN?
I'm not sure I understood. What do you mean with that?
Recently, the U.S. has really been involved in Israel with recognizing Israel's capital, moving their embassy. What implications does that have to the UN?
I'm not a supporter of the president, but I'm a supporter of this decision. This decision was made, in fact, by the U.S. Congress in 1995. And if I'm not totally mistaken, I don't know which majority existed in Congress in 1995.
It was when the Republicans were starting to switch.
Yeah, but a lot of Democrats voted in favor. That I'm sure. I mean, the vote was overwhelming in Congress. So this was simply the enactment of a decision by the U.S. Congress. It's not a win of the president. See what I mean?
Yeah,
so I think it's out of the question. Jerusalem is the capital. Period. Now, Jerusalem is also the capital of two other religions, aside from the Jewish, also the Muslim and the Catholic, the Christian. Okay? To the extent Israel is capable of defending and enhancing the nature, the double capacity of Jerusalem, and let the faithful of all religions worship, pay homage, etc., the legitimacy is undisputable. This is my very personal view. It's not, and I think the vote in the UN about this is a sorry story. This is my personal opinion. It's disputable like all other opinions, but it's a sorry story that only 8 countries supported the US in this decision. The truth of the matter is that Israel is a pariah in the United Nations and doesn't have to be one. No country should be a pariah worldwide. No country. Not Israel, not Russia, not Peru, not Norway, not Japan, no country. So if inside of the UN, nobody wants to destroy, say, Ivory Coast. There is no country that says Ivory Coast must cease to exist. Iran does say Israel must cease to exist. There is even a sign in Tehran with a countdown to the... It's nuts. Completely. I mean, with this, what do you expect? Do you expect world peace to happen? No. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen, and it won't happen until there is a full recognition that this state that has existed for 70 years, now in May it will be 70 years, is legitimate, period.
But then do you think that Nikki Haley's suggestion to cut U.S. funding to the UN is bad?
But no comment. No comment on this. I have my opinions. I can tell you later. This belongs to the U.S. foreign policy. It's not related to the UN, so I don't comment on this. Don't take it personally.
No.
More questions? Yes.
Okay. So you briefly mentioned North Korea.
Mhm.
What do you think about, especially specifically the USA and just in general the UN? What do you think of how they're approaching the crisis in North Korea and in general the nuclear crisis?
Okay, I don't think teasing North Korea is the right thing to do. And because the first thing that one should become acquainted with when talking about Korea and North Korea especially is the terrible resentment that people nurture vis-a-vis the United States. It's terrible. Is it justified? 70%, yes. There is an incredible film which I recommend you watch. It's probably not difficult to find it on Amazon or other devilish agencies. It's called Crossing the Border, and it's the story of a US soldier, a survivor, the only survivor of the 4 who crossed over from South to North Korea, each for their own reasons. 2 died, 1 left later, but Dresnok is still there. An old man who tells a very interesting story, through which you understand pretty much everything. You understand pretty much everything. So, Comrade Kim Jong-un, is he nuts or is he, we don't know. I wish he could be medically examined like Trump was the other day, and we could share the results of his examination, but I'm afraid it won't happen. But teasing and bickering with the button, etc.,
Yeah.
not good. By the way, there was a fantastic joke, always on Facebook. There's a fake profile of Kim Jong-un. There are several. But there's one, and when Trump said, my button is bigger, Kim replies, no, it's your hand that is smaller. Which I found was quite funny. No, but now seriously, no. I think the North Korea problem should be approached calmly, slowly, and mostly in conjunction with China, because North Korea depends 150% on China. So China should be persuaded in a way or another to encourage reform in North Korea, which is not easy. But if Kim realizes that his survival might depend on reform, then you never know. Fidel Castro has died. His brother is stepping down in 2 months or 3 months, this spring. Again, if the US don't start bickering with the new leader of Cuba, Cuba will move slowly towards a Gorbachev-type reform. It's inevitable. It's inevitable because they know that it's one of the two. Either you lose power brutally, as happened, for example, in East Germany or Romania, etc., or you lose it gradually. But you have chances of surviving politically after your change of regime, understand? So this the Cuban have understood fully. And this is why Obama went to Cuba two years ago. He went to Cuba precisely in order to encourage this process. Will Kim learn from this? Je ne sais pas. We will see. That's it. The grown-ups are intimidated. Okay. Yes. Oh, sorry. Yes.
What would you say is the biggest existential threat to the UN?
I cannot hear you. Sorry.
What would you say is the biggest existential threat to the UN in the next kind of decade?
The biggest threat currently?
Yeah.
Things running out of control. The three great powers, US, Russia, China, are not communicating very well with one another. The US-Russia connection is very complex, and the more they dig into it, the more it becomes complex. With China, it's also Russia and China gets along with one another, but if there is no common agreement on a number of things, things could run out of hand, seriously. On Korea, Ukraine, the residual ISIS, Syria, etc. It's possible to reach an agreement. It's not easy, but it's possible. But I don't see any steps in that direction, honestly. And that's bad. That's a threat. So no effort towards, because, you know, ideologically, there's no more. I mean, after the Cold War, what is the point of having ideological disputes? China is still, of course, communist, even though it has a completely capitalist economy. But it's pragmatic enough and flexible on some things. So why don't you insist on common things and try to achieve some results? I don't see that effort, honestly. Unfortunately. Hopefully it will appear sooner or later, but for the time being I don't see it. Yes?
Hello, hi, nice to meet you. In your opinion, what would be a good move to make UN 2.0? What would be good changes in policy that would effectively make the UN more efficient?
Mm-hmm. Good question.
More effective.
Okay. The Farnesina produced in the early 90s a very sound proposal to reform the Security Council. Very good. Very good. Unfortunately, it didn't work. But it's very logical because, for example, they say, pointless to add and detrimental to us to add other permanent seats. We wouldn't get one, Italy, so let's leave it aside. But we don't have to add seats. We have to reduce the power of the permanent five through a process of greater democracy. So they made a proposal whereby the semi-permanent membership would be created alongside the non-permanent and the permanent, semi-permanent of the Security Council. 30 countries elected by the Assembly, that for a period of 18 or 24 years rotate inside of the Security Council, alongside the non-permanent and the permanent, which remain as they are. But it hasn't worked. You need 129 affirmative votes because it's 2/3, and it's 129 or 130 out of 190, 93, 94 countries. And it's been impossible to reach. And it never asked for a proper vote because it would have burnt the proposal is forever. Like poor Renzi last year. I'm still weeping at it. It should never ask for a proper vote because it never was assured of the necessary majority. You see, so it remains floating in the air. A lot of people say it's good, but unfortunately, bureaucracy is very conservative. Bureaucracies are terribly conservative. So they don't want to change. Not only in Italy. Trust me. It's a common problem. More questions? Okay. You have a question from here? Or? No. Ah, okay. Okay, all right. All right.
So I'd like to ask you all to join me in thanking Mr. Argentieri one last time. So. I would also like to highlight the applicability of the content of this lecture to Model United Nations and invite all the attendees who participate in Model United Nations to carefully reflect upon what you have learned today. And lastly, I would like to thank all members of the staff, students, parents, and students from St. George's for attending. Also, most importantly, I would like to thank Ms. Cameron for organizing this lecture. None of this would have been possible without her. And that's all.